All right, let's get started.
Okay.
Welcome to Trends in AI from Zeta Alpha, live from the Responsible AI in the Military conference. And as a special guest for today's show, we have Professor Stuart Russell from the University of California in Berkeley. What was the most surprising thing that you have heard over the last 2 days?
So I went to a session on AI and nuclear weapons. So will there be involvement of AI in the nuclear chain of command and control? That was,
which is a bit bigger fish than $20 drones, right?
well, yes and no, right? Because it's you're talking about $1 million $20 drones, and that can be just as bad, if not worse, than a hydrogen bomb in terms of lethal capacity. But certainly the nuclear weapons exist already, and would you want to turn over the decision to launch nuclear weapons to an AI system? So of course, the people in that panel who are working for nonprofits and peace organizations were pretty clear that this would be a bad idea. But we also heard actually from the United States today, I believe it was today or yesterday, that this is now their official position, that there will not be AI intervening in the chain of command over the launch of nuclear weapons. So that was a very positive announcement that I was pretty happy to hear.
All right. So among your multiple blood groups, how would you describe your own distribution between techie and policy influencer in these days?
Well, I mean, I think of myself as 100% techie, but I have sort of been dragged into this policy arena, partly because most of what I heard didn't make any sense. And I thought that this is clearly a serious issue. So the topic we're all discussing is really, should we allow fully autonomous lethal weapons? Right? In other words, weapons that can locate and select and attack human targets with no human involvement.
Yeah, and this conference must feel like a vindication of your long-term ideas, because you started advocating within our field among AI and robotics professionals in 2015, 2016 about this topic. So what brought you there?
So what brought me there was, in a strange way, a kind of accident. I was a member of, and I still am a member of Human Rights Watch, which has been a very effective organization for several decades, talking about human-generated atrocities and how to prevent them. And around 2013, they sent an email out to, I'm a member of the Northern California Council, so they sent an email out to their council members saying, we're creating this new campaign, and we've been talking about how bad all those humans are. Well, actually, no, humans are good. It's the robots who are really bad. And we've got to do everything we can to stop killer robots.
Yeah, since you were in the same lab as the roboticists at Berkeley, you thought, I have to do something about it.
Well, my first thought was actually to be a bit confused, because, for Human Rights Watch to say, no, humans are good on the battlefield and it's the robots who are bad, that was a bit of a change in their fundamental position. But also, when you look at the details of the argument, it had to do with the inability of robots to distinguish between civilians and legitimate combatants who could be targeted. And to an AI researcher, that's sort of an insult. Right? And you say, well, I bet you we can solve that problem. All right. And so I'm thinking, okay, I'm not buying this.
Let's not be solving this.
I'm not buying this campaign, right? It's not making a lot of sense to me. But then I thought about it some more, and I thought about how the technology would horribly evolve. And as with many other technologies, it seemed to me that it would evolve towards smaller and smaller more and more agile lethal weapons.
Yeah, kind of the swarm drones.
Exactly.
And
So
yeah.
as you move towards small weapons, and in fact, I had just bought my kids on a trip to China a couple of years before. I bought them quadcopters that were 1 inch in diameter, or 2.5 centimeters
Wow.
wide, right? And they are radio controlled, and they cost about $2.50. Um, so so you could imagine that that could become a lethal weapon, and then because of this property of autonomy, namely that the human does not need to find the target, doesn't need to pilot the thing towards the target, that inevitably leads to the idea that you can launch very large swarms of lethal weapons, which effectively amount to weapons of mass destruction. So then I wrote back to Human Rights Watch saying, well, I don't really agree with the arguments you're making, but I think that nonetheless we should put all our efforts into banning these kinds of weapons because of this tendency that they will end up as weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. That was a very foresighted moment, I think. At that moment, not many people were thinking about this, right?
Yeah, I don't know that anybody was talking in those terms. But not just weapons of mass destruction, but weapons of mass destruction that will be very easily acquired by all kinds of, not just countries, but terrorist groups, even criminal gangs. And that would basically render large parts of the world sort of uninhabitable for humans. And this is not the future that we want, right? We're trying to go to a world where everyone has physical security, and this would take us in the wrong direction entirely. So as you say, in 2015, the AI community started to get its act together with some help from some nonprofit institutes like the Future of Life Institute. And we put together this open letter. Originally, I had posted an article in Nature making this argument, and then that became this open letter, which tens of thousands of researchers signed. We wrote another letter directly to President Obama and to Prime Minister David Cameron in the UK from a much smaller group of leading scientists. So all of the main senior scientists in artificial intelligence signed up to these letters. And here we are.
And here we are.
It's 2023.
About 7 years later. And obviously the topic is now very much in everybody's attention, right?
So there's a lot of attention. Is it the right kind of attention? And have things...
So what has happened since? What are like maybe let's focus on two areas. What has happened in the technology space? What do you know about like the current state of AI in military, in lethal weaponry? What has happened on the policy side? Why are people gathering here in The Hague to discuss this topic?
So on the technology side, as we know, AI has progressed rapidly. And if you want to think about feasibility of these kinds of weapons, think about self-driving cars. The task of a self-driving car involves navigating, detecting humans in the environment, and making tactical decisions about where to go and so on. You can imagine it would not be that difficult to reprogram the self-driving car so that when it sees a pedestrian, it actually runs them over, right?
Would fit your definition, absolutely. Yeah.
So the basic difficulties in creating a lethal weapon, I think all the technologies exist to do that. And the important characteristic actually of weapons compared to self-driving cars is that a weapon that works 50-60% of the time is considered pretty good. Bullets actually in World War II, more than 1,000, possibly as many as 10,000 bullets were fired for every casualty. So bullets as a weapon of war, right, is less than 1%, maybe 1/10% or less effectiveness. something that you send it out and 50% of the time it reaches its target and kills somebody. That's an incredibly effective weapon. A self-driving car has to be 99.999999% reliable. So the challenges in self-driving technology are actually far greater than we face in the weapons area.
Yeah.
To give you an example of how the technology is moving along, in 2017,
self-driving cars are not on the road yet. Well, maybe in
they
San
are in
Francisco,
San Francisco, and
in
Phoenix,
trials,
and
right?
several cities,
but
in
not
China.
at large scale. So
Not on a large scale.
how is that with AI in weapon systems?
So with weapon systems, in November of 2017, we released a short film called Slaughterbots,
Yep.
which tried to illustrate the threat that we're concerned about, which is large swarms of anti-personnel autonomous weapons. And we released that in Geneva at the meeting called the CCW, where the countries are negotiating about whether there's going to be a ban on autonomous weapons. And I remember very clearly, we showed the movie, a whole bunch of ambassadors were in the audience, and the Russian ambassador said, "Why are we even discussing this kind of weapon? They won't exist for another 30 years. This is just science fiction, it's pointless."
Yep.
3 weeks later, STM in Turkey announced the Kargu drone, announced its capability for fully autonomous hits on human targets based on face recognition and figure tracking, moving targets, all the rest of it. So everything that we depicted in the movie, they were selling. They were selling as a weapon, and presumably that had already been in development for many months at that point. So what hasn't happened is so far is a large-scale sort of Manhattan Project-like effort to produce and manufacture on a massive scale really effective lethal autonomous weapons. And in fact, several manufacturers, including STM, have dialed down the claims and saying, well, of course,
Yeah, and we've seen manufacturers like Boston Dynamics actually kind of making these pledges as well,
Boston
right?
Dynamics sort of pulled out altogether, but STM said, okay, well, the Kargu really is going to be operated, remotely by a human operator, and they stopped talking about fully autonomous mode.
Yeah, so this kind of this meaningful human control, that's an important concept there.
Yeah,
right?
So there's a fair degree of consensus on this phrase, as you say, meaningful human control. So in Geneva, they've tried to find common ground, because the way the Geneva negotiations work is that any country can put a stop to discussions. So they have to proceed by consensus, which means they can only make very weak agreements unless there's a sort of obvious international consensus. And at the moment, their positions are all over the map. Partly because, as the foreign minister just said here at the meeting, the politicians and the policymakers don't understand the technical issues, and so they're reluctant to commit to a decision.
And if we talk about consensus and controversy, so here we are in The Hague 2023 at the Responsible AI in the Military conference. And so how would you kind of quickly summarize the points that we have consensus about in this audience, at least, and how where would you see like the points which are more controversial?
So when you look at the details of what people are actually agreeing on, it tends to actually kind of evaporate. So there's, I would say, tentative agreement, and about 70 countries have put their names to something saying that we think that weapons that operate completely outside human control should be banned.
Yeah, it's in the European AI Act, for example, right?
Well, no, the European AI Act actually is not about weapons at all.
Oh, I thought it does mention them in the forbidden category. But
the AI Act, because defense is national sovereignty and not European,
Right.
the AI Act does not bear upon decisions about weapon systems. But the idea of an AI system, a weapon that operates completely outside human control, what does that mean? It seems to mean weapons that by themselves can wake up in the morning and say, hey, we're going to start a war with, Lesotho, and we're going to all go and attack Lesotho, right? With no human being involved in that
No,
decision.
there's consensus that that's a bad thing.
Right, there's a consensus that's a bad thing, but I mean, that's not,
Yeah.
right? No one is even talking about making such a thing. What we're talking about is weapons that are given a mission, right? So the mission might be go into this area of this city and wipe out anyone you find.
No.
Right? That would be a much more specific. It's the human
which is quite similar to what cruise missiles do in some sense, right?
Yes, it could be. And the difference being that with a cruise missile, you designate the GPS coordinates that the missile is going to land on.
Yeah.
And you have to have a good reason to believe that that's a legitimate military
Yeah,
target.
which is in the human chain of command, the human accountability.
Yeah, and if you launch a cruise missile without having enough information and not having good reason to believe that there's no civilians there, you would be criminally liable for a war crime.
Yeah.
So anyway, coming back to what is the international consensus, and what is this meeting about, right? This is basically assuming that the weapons are going to exist, and how can we make sure that they're used responsibly?
Yeah.
But imagine if we were sitting here talking about, responsible use of biological weapons in the military, right? That yes, we've created these biological weapons which can infect millions of people with horrible diseases that cause them to die in agony, but we're going to find responsible ways to use these weapons. That will be ridiculous, right? What an unethical thing to do, right? And what concerns me is that people are only thinking about ethics as applied to use and not as applied to existence, right? There's an ethical decision that has to be made. Do we allow these types of weapons to come into existence? And I think the ethical decision there is different depending on whether you're talking about anti-personnel weapons, which can be multiplied by the millions and launched as such, versus, for example, an autonomous submarine, where, first of all, there aren't any civilians under the water. And second, no one is going to be buying millions of submarines because they're still going to be really expensive. And so the issues there are completely different. They have more to do with, perhaps accidental hostilities emerging because the two sides submarines run into each other or misinterpret the other side's behavior. So what I've been trying to do here actually is to point to this need for making a decision about existence, that there's an ethical case and even a common sense case that if we create what will amount to weapons of mass destruction that are cheap, that are easy to use, that don't leave behind a huge radioactive crater, that will be available in all the arms supermarkets of the world. And when I say cheap, you can buy landmines for about $6.
No.
And they're actually quite a bit more. They have a lot more explosive in than we need for, a fully autonomous anti-personnel weapon.
No.
So that's the kind of price that I think we might be looking at in a few years' time if we go down this route. So that puts it well within the financial resources of terrorist groups to buy millions of weapons. And that would be a disaster for the world. The only way we're going to prevent it is not by saying, oh, well, let's make sure the software is ethical,
Yeah.
right? Because of course,
So you feel like that the responsible in this conference is a bit of a wrong perspective on the discussion. You think it's should be more of an existential discussion and not so much on where do we exactly put those
if they
gray lines.
responsible decisions about
Yeah.
AI in the military, you would have been much happier.
Yeah, and then you would have said
Use of AI.
there's only one responsible decision in some sense. But obviously AI and autonomous is not the same thing, right? So
there's lots of other kinds of AI that you could use for intelligence analysis, for logistics, for military planning, for management of operations, all kinds of things that could make military campaigns more effective and could have very significant strategic implications.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about that. And I actually believe that the AI community has some obligation to help the defense community, because after all, our taxes are
that
paying,
marriage is going to be there.
our taxes are paying these
Yeah.
people, and they're willing to die to protect us.
Yeah.
So it's not really reasonable for us to say we're not going to help you.
Yeah.
Right. But creating this category of weapons would end up reducing security for everyone on Earth.
Yeah.
And we have to go.
And one thing I'm curious about, so obviously 2023 we have a major war going on in Ukraine, in Europe.
Yeah.
We have a very rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. Has that influenced your thinking on this topic, or do you think it's a matter of principles, or does kind of the current day reality creep into your to change your opinions as it shifts?
So that's a great question. I think one thing that it's certainly done is make it ridiculously hard to make any progress in Geneva, because Russia is continually trying to shut down the discussions. I think probably the fact that China has largely sided with Russia has made it much more difficult to establish trust between the US and China. And that issue of trust between the US and China is the major problem that we face. Because even if the US were to agree that we ought to ban a category of weapons here, they don't trust that other countries, particularly China, would abide by any such agreement, even if they signed it.
Yeah.
So without that trust and without the willingness or even the ability at the moment to talk to each other, we can't, for example, take the steps we need to establish verification mechanisms, which are really important for these kinds of treaties. And if you look at the Chemical Weapons Convention, right, which has many of the same characteristics in the sense that there's already a big chemical industry in the world. Many of the chemicals they make can be used as weapons. How on earth have they managed to
dual use technology
have a ban on chemical weapons? Well, the answer is they created a verification regime where all manufacturers who produce chemicals on a long list of precursor or directly usable lethal chemicals have to account for their production. They have to check the bona fides of their customers. They have to know where the chemicals are going and what they're being used for. And that's been very effective.
But I can imagine, like our, the tools and trade of our profession as AI engineers and researchers, are algorithms and data sets, and those are much harder to, like this dual use aspect of AI technology. Anybody can download a computer vision library, which is very powerful.
So I don't anticipate that any methods could constrain the proliferation of software. And I think that's sort of a waste of time to try.
We see that now in the Ukraine war. The chips in the tanks are still coming from our factories to some extent, right?
But
that's not even software.
What we're interested in is the mass scale manufacture of the physical weapons platforms. And there I think we have a reasonable chance. So what are these weapons platforms, right? Well, they are, for example, small quadcopters. Well, there's a few manufacturers of quadcopters in the world. and
The most popular ones being in China.
being China, as you
Yeah.
say. And you can require that if someone is trying to buy very large numbers of quadcopters, then you have to find out who they are, what they're going to do with them. You know, if it's some post office box in Libya, then you're going to say, well, sorry, we can't send you 5 million quadcopters because we can't verify that you're a legitimate customer.
Yeah, so it's really the aspect of the technology plus the mass production that you would like politicians to regulate.
Yeah. So there's a lot of technical questions. How do you prevent repurposing of remotely piloted weapons? Because that's a potential risk that people could say, oh yeah, we've got all these remotely piloted weapons, but we just flip a software
updates,
and now they're fully autonomous.
Yeah.
And so this gets into technical details, but this is a technical detail show.
Yeah.
So one thing you want to do is separate onboard computing, so physical separation between onboard computing and any kind of firing circuit. So the ability to actually engage in the attack can only be delivered by a remote link and not by any onboard computing. So that's one. You also want to establish
like a cryptographic separation in some sense, or where
a physical separation,
where you require a human to actually.
There is no wire connecting or local radio or optical link. There's no physical connection between the onboard computing, right, which is doing stabilization of the airframe and whatever else it might be, possibly navigating, but any decision about firing or kamikaze self-destruct would have to be coming from a remote link from a human. And also you want to establish that, okay, you say you have all these remotely piloted weapons, where are the human control stations to go with them? And where are the trained pilots? And so so those kinds of measures, I mean, they're a little different from some other arms control measures, but you'd be surprised, actually, when arms control treaties are signed, a lot of detailed agreements are made.
Yeah, a lot of people actually work to
and for example, New START, which is about nuclear missiles between the US and what was then Soviet Union, now Russia. That involves up to 18 visits every year from each side to pretty much any nuclear weapons facility of the other side to inspect, check that things are not being manufactured, etc., etc. So it's, I think it's a good idea to start discussing those questions, right? Could we establish a verification regime? Could we agree on certain types of inspections, on measures to ensure that industrial production is not diverted, and so on. These measures, I think, can be effective, and they can be discussed without any commitment to a treaty or a ban on any particular category of weapons, but they are, as happened, for example, with the nuclear test ban treaty. Before that treaty came into existence in 1996, there were 2 decades of discussions among scientists from mainly from the US and Russia about how you might verify that treaty. And
so you think that to some extent that this is a discussion for engineers and researchers to engage in, even before before informing the policymakers.
Heaven forbid that the policymakers are the ones carrying out these discussions.
Right. Interesting.
There's a lot of misunderstanding.
Yeah, there's a large gap in their knowledge of what is possible there. And so if you maybe to kind of close off, if you see people in our own profession, robotics, AI, engineers and researchers in the large industrial research labs or in academia, what would you recommend that they get connected with in terms of knowledge, or that they do in order to promote this point of view?
So there's lots of information available on at least 2 main websites. One is stopkillerrobots.org, the other one is autonomousweapons.org. And also think about getting active, in the chapter of your professional society, whether it's IEEE or ACM, the main ones, or AAAI. because I think fairly soon there are going to be serious discussions about whether those professional societies will actually declare a policy on lethal autonomous weapons. Just as all the major chemical societies in the world have declared their support for a treaty banning chemical weapons, and you are not allowed as a member of those societies to work on chemical weapons, just as you are not allowed as a doctor to assist in executions and so on. So many professional societies have these policies,
Yeah.
and I think it's likely that.
Yeah. So you think that let's say self-regulation in our profession and field is the number one step to
for a scientist. I mean, you can also talk to your local political representative and so on, but it's not really on the radar of most politicians at the moment.
Yeah.
It's on some defense ministers and foreign ministers, but the typical local and member of parliament probably not. The other thing you can do, particularly if you find it exciting to work on the challenges of developing these weapons, is to remember one thing.
And what is that one thing?
That one thing is that if you're working on this, probably your counterpart in another country is also working on this. How would you feel about that weapon arriving at your house to attack your family?
All right. Well, that's a good thing to keep in mind. So, Stuart, thank you so much for this interview.
Pleasure.
I hope you enjoy The Hague despite the typically Dutch weather. And
it's fine. The Hague is a very hospitable place.
Yeah.
Trends in AI is brought to you by Zeta Alpha, the smarter way to discover and organize knowledge in AI and beyond. Sign up for a free trial on www.zeta-alpha.com.